Unlike the two speakers I've reviewed previously in this series, the Key Audio 3 and the Dutch and Dutch 8C, these Sigberg Audio Saranna speakers are not a studio or pro audio product originally, although the company did get its start in the pro audio world. This is their latest product, and they are designed from the ground up for recreational listening. The company is Norwegian and named after and run by Torbjörn Sigberg. Torbjörn Sigberg, if you want to mangle his name. It's a fairly young company with their first products coming to market about 5 years ago. I think there is some availability in North America now, but it remains largely a sort of direct to consumer brand. From the long list of potential features that you can theoretically build into an active speaker and that you thus cannot build into a traditional passive speaker, these actually don't tick that many boxes. There is no automated room calibration, there's no volume control, there is no network connectivity, so there's no streaming services and no app or web interfaces to control them. But, to paraphrase myself from a prior video, features you don't have can't break. The cabinets are made of MDF with a veneer on the sides and are available in two colors, fade to black, or as in my review pair here, shady white. Mounting them on the included bottom plate is optional, but it makes the speaker a little harder to topple if, like me, you have a feral 4-year-old roaming around the house. You can add spikes or other footers to the plates or to the speakers without the plates. The speakers ship with these rubber feet. The front covers attach magnetically, but I left them off for my listening. The covers are actually way larger than what's necessary to cover the drivers, but I think that makes for a more pleasing look when you have them on. The price is tied to the Norwegian currency, so it fluctuates in other currencies depending on exchange rates. But right now, they're about 21,000 euro, a little bit above, and that includes shipping and setup advice and so on. The whole design is leaned back slightly, which is normally done to time align different drivers, but not here. The Sarannas use a point source driver where the tweeter sits concentrically inside of the mid-range driver, which is often referred to as a coaxial driver because they share the same axis of movement. In practically every case, and certainly above the bass, you ideally want a speaker to be, or at least behave like a point source, since greater separation in space between the sort of emission points of various frequencies will make it more difficult for the sound to feel like a coherent whole, or make it so that the frequencies blend correctly only at a certain distance away from the speakers. Because point source drivers avoid that problem, they tend to excel at things like soundstage, scale, and precision. So why doesn't everyone use a point source driver? Well, because just like with every other design ever, there are inherent compromises, and in several different ways. For example, you can get diffraction, where sounds from the tweeter housing can color the sounds from the surrounding mid-range driver, and the mid-range cone basically acts as a waveguide for the tweeter, but a conventional waveguide doesn't vibrate, but a mid-range driver does. And here, the cone has to be designed primarily to emit mid-range frequencies and not to be the optimal shape for tweeter dispersion. And all of this can lead to things like comb filtering type effects, especially off-axis, and other distortions too. Some of this can, in theory, be remedied with an elaborate crossover design, and active speakers with digital crossovers, like these, actually has a much easier time not just implementing these compensations, but also developing them. Iterating on a digital crossover is much faster than doing so in a physical one. Code tends to be faster than soldering. The wider the frequency range of a coaxial driver is, the more it exacerbates the challenges that these designs have. But in the Sarannas, the driver is not handling the deep bass, which makes things, at least in theory, a little less challenging than it could be. Now, while I normally try to separate the sort of factual information about a product in the earlier parts of a review, like right now, versus the listening impressions in the latter half, let me just get one thing out of the way now, because we're talking about the coaxial driver and the potential problems it could have. During the review period, I was consistently unable to hear any evidence of these potential shortcomings that coaxial drivers could have. I knew about them, I listened for them, I couldn't find them. But yeah, the front-facing drivers aren't handling the bass, so what is? Much like the Key 3 and the Dutch and Dutch 8C, the bass drivers are facing backwards. In fact, these are the same wave chord drivers as on the 8C, although both brands make their own little modifications to them. And like with DAC chips and, well, everything else, implementation can make a massive difference to the sound. Here, the two bass drivers sit much further apart than on the stand mount 8C, which Sigberg claims helps to achieve a smoother frequency response. Now, smoother compared to what, I'm not sure, because spectral linearity wasn't a problem with the 8C, but I suppose it makes for a simpler implementation overall. This is all driven by a 3-channel Hypex Encore Class D amplifier with DSP, that's 600 watts per speaker, and Hypex internals also handle the D to A and A to D conversions. The limited edition badge here is for a production run from 2025, and they're no longer sold in the limited edition version, but there are no sonic differences versus the regular version. Unlike the Key 3 and the Dutch and Dutch 8C with their studio heritage, the inputs here are much more suitable for the average recreational listener, with analog inputs on both RCA and XLR, and digital inputs on optical toslink, coaxial SPDIF, and AES. The latter two support up to 24-bit 192 kHz resolution, while optical caps out at 96 kHz. If you connect a digital source, make really sure that it has a volume control because a full-scale digital signal will come out extremely loud from these speakers. There is no way to control the volume on the speakers themselves. The USB input is for parametric EQ and additional settings. There's no support for USB audio, but more on the USB stuff later. A toggle button on the back cycles between 3 EQ presets per speaker, pre-configured on this pair as flat, bass slightly boosted, and bass slightly lowered. But it seems moving forwards, the presets will be flat plus 1.5 dB and then plus 3 dB bass. Since there's no remote, app, or web interface, switching the presets require you to go up to the speakers and reach around the back. And make sure to set both speakers to the same setting, as there's no automatic synchronization. As with the Dutch and Dutch 8C, there are openings on the sides that lets the inverted face of the forward sound come out on the sides to dampen frequencies that want to wrap around the enclosure and become omnidirectional. Positive wave meets negative wave, which results ideally in no wave. Here, the cardioid effect is not quite as pronounced as with the 8C, specified to be 10 to 16 dB attenuation across the mid-range rather than 8C's 18 to 25 dB, and starting a little bit higher at 130 Hz versus about 100 Hz on the 8C. In theory, this less pronounced cardioid pattern could mean that the Sarannas are a little bit more sensitive to interaction with room acoustics, but like in the grand scheme of things, and given the other differences versus the 8Cs, I wasn't able to find any music or placement where this hypothetical disadvantage was clearly evident. That doesn't mean it wasn't there, of course. So all I'm saying is it wasn't obvious, at least not to me and in this room, that they excited room modes any more than the Dutch and Dutch 8C. With digital, the speakers can be daisy-chained over both AES and coaxial SPDIF. And over SPDIF specifically, at least with the cables I have, it often takes about 5 seconds before the second speaker realizes it's getting signal and comes alive, which is a little bit annoying when you're starting to play music. But once it does come alive, it stays on until you play through a different input. And speaking of inputs, there's no way to select input on the speakers, but they seem to do well reacting to and switching to whatever input is receiving signal. At least I never had an issue of getting sound out of them. Placement-wise, Sigberg recommends distance from the wall, back wall, front wall. It's back wall to the speakers, but front wall to the listener. That wall, a distance from that wall of 15 to 50 centimeters, which is A, super close, and B, the same sort of recommendation that Dutch and Dutch uses for the 8Cs. In many rooms, this is a great relief because most people simply don't have the space to pull them out a meter or more from the wall that some speakers benefit from. And like the Dutch and Dutch and also like the Key 3, they utilize the wall for greater bass output. You don't have to push them up against the wall though, and like with the prior speakers in this series, I ended up preferring them quite a bit further out into the room than the recommended distance. And maybe that is because of some acoustic properties of this particular wall, or how the increased listening distance of that placement gives me more room tone, or maybe I'm sensitive to some particular side effect of the bass wall support. Sigberg also suggests that the distance to the listener should not be longer than the distance between the speakers, and if I push them further back, my listening triangle gets kind of pointy. Without wall support and on the factory default P2 preset, which on this pair was the slight bass boost, they sounded super coherent and pleasing in this position and could still deliver all the bass loudness and extension I needed. And this is sort of a 31 square meter room, so decent size. You can change the EQ curve of each of the three presets per speaker with a piece of Windows software. That program comes from Hypex, that manufactures the input boards and DAC and amp modules used here, and it is not super intuitive. I think this is software made for speaker designers much more so than for consumers. Now, you can load impulse response data from other software like REW, so in theory, you can use that to measure and design filters to adapt to your specific room. But this process is much more complex than even the old calibration method of Dutch and Dutch speakers. So I would wager that the vast majority of consumers will want to consult a professional for this, since it's pretty easy to mess things up. Now, if you buy the speakers from Sigberg, they will include consultation around these things. But once you do have your speaker placement established, I think setting up a preset for low volume listening or for a certain genre, or maybe for when you play vinyl, for example, is a really good idea. Now, a slight housekeeping note here, literally and figuratively, because it's about the house. Unlike the two prior videos in the series, I didn't test these in the upstairs living room. The reason being, I've already sort of verified how other cardioid speakers behave in this room versus that room, so I don't think it adds that much value for me or for you. Plus, these are kind of awkward to carry. They're 44 kilos each. I can lift more, but the shape means that I have to like navigate them up really narrow stairs, and I'm afraid to bump into something and damage the speakers. So I figured I'd avoid it this time around. I mostly played analog out from my Grim Audio MU2. This covered both Roon streaming and vinyl playback. Unusually, actually, my phono stage has a volume control, and the Sarannas have an RCA input, so I could connect vinyl straight into the speakers, but I find the MU2's volume control to be super transparent, and its remote is a better interface. And yes, the MU2 only has analog outputs, so this meant that the signal gets redigitized inside of the speakers, undoing most of the unique conversion magic supplied by the MU2. I did try other sources, and more on that later in this video, but just know that the majority of listening impressions I am about to describe are derived from feeding these speakers an analog signal, although from a very competent DAC. There will be some comparisons with other speakers in this series, primarily the Dutch and Dutch HC, because they're sort of kindred spirits in a way. But if that's all I did, that sort of comparison, you wouldn't get a really good idea of how these feel when listened to over time. So primarily, I'm going to describe them on their own merits. Getting to know these speakers has taken a lot of time because I found it so extremely difficult to skip ahead or hop between genres. I just keep melting into the music immediately instead of, methodically going through test tracks and analyzing what I hear. So I didn't get much progress on listening to various different things for a long while because I put on one thing and I just want to remain inside of that thing forever. Now, all of this is, of course, a compliment. They are exceedingly easy to get lost in, and at least to me, I don't know about you, but to me, that's one of the most important attributes of any hi-fi system. The speakers are full range, not 20 hertz anechoically, but according to Sigberg and to my ears as well, they reach basically infrasound in room, at least in this room. And they do so sufficiently loud, even without maximizing the bass support from the back wall or front wall or whatever you call that wall. So unless you listen at, beyond 100 decibel, which will mess up your hearing no matter how smooth the treble is, so please don't listen that loudly, or you have a gargantuan room, there's not going to be any sort of spectral shortcomings here. And speaking of infrasound or very deep bass, my biggest takeaway, I think, so far in this series is that these active speakers all do bass in a way that I thought we couldn't really get in regular domestic rooms and from sort of modestly sized speakers. And yes, these are larger because they're floor standards, but the sort of floor surface area footprint isn't necessarily any larger than with the prior stand mount speakers that I've reviewed. Here's a size example with a 186 centimeter man. So not tiny, but also not enormous. Despite the almost identical pair of wavecore subs on the back as the Dutch and Dutch 8Cs, something about the bass here feels comparatively sort of a little bit grippier and drier. This is comparing to the 8Cs with and without room matching, with and without custom adjustment curves, and in multiple rooms and multiple positions. Now, of course, this is a much bigger enclosure, and at least historically, before DSP slapped the loss of physics in its face, that has been easier to get really good bass out of. But at the same time, the bass here is just as well integrated with the upper frequencies, and I can't really fault either speaker in that regard. They both sound amazingly coherent and whole. But while a smidge more sort of firm than the 8Cs, the bass here is still cozier and rounder than the physics-defying laser precision bass of the Key 3s that I was so impressed by. There were tracks where these showed me that there were bass nuances that I hadn't noticed with the prior speakers in this series, like in Heilung's Svanrand, or however you're supposed to pronounce their semi-made-up Proto-European language. Other times, though, I felt like the bass was almost monotone, but I think what is going on here is that these speakers reveal a little bit more richness where it exists, and subsequently shows that the emperor has no clothes when a recording's bass simply isn't that great. That's not to say that they sound extra bad with bad recordings. They're not making anything worse, but they spoil me by showing how good things can be. It was really interesting to hear the detrimental effects of too much bass by using the bass boost preset with a near wall placement. Everything became more muddied and indistinct and unengaging, even with music that wasn't very bass heavy. Now, thankfully, these speakers do have that preset toggle, so you could just walk up to them and change it. But I think a reason a lot of passive speakers aren't designed for this kind of bass output might be that it makes them much harder to place in regular living rooms. With my music and in this room and my personal preferences, I think the Saranna's flavor of grip and precision is the slightly more appealing presentation. But I imagine if you listen to a lot of acoustic music, like jazz, for example, which I don't really, the scales might tilt a little bit in a different direction. And given the practically inexhaustible filtering options on the Dutch and Dutch 8Cs and the fact that they're using the same drivers, perhaps they can be tweaked to sound and feel a lot more like this if you want to. And if you have room issues to fight against, the 8Cs with their more advanced DSP and their even stronger dispersion control might be the better weapon to help you win that battle. But if you want this particular presentation out of the box literally and figuratively, the Sarannas deliver it. Perhaps appropriately for a speaker with a coaxial driver, I don't want to report on highs and mids individually here, since my conclusion is basically that it all fits together so incredibly well and the sound feels so free of faults and strain that sort of dissecting it is meaningless and perhaps even counterproductive. Problems in the upper frequencies are what usually causes excess listening fatigue, but I didn't experience any such problems here. Nor are they overly polite. The sound isn't at all indistinct or recessed or muddled, as long as you have the right bass preset active, depending on your placement. In fact, these speakers can be impressively sharp and snappy and jagged, but they present those attributes in an unusually natural sounding way. Now, I do have two other pairs of speakers in this room that convey an even greater sense of sort of micro detail and ultra fine texture information. One pair would be my Focal Scala Utopia, the original Scala Utopia design, and the other pair I'll talk about at the end of this video. But if I had not had these other speakers side by side, I would not have known and maybe not even been able to imagine that there was any more resolution to be had. I didn't feel like I was missing anything with these speakers. And again, I have to stress that the overall coherency here, which is much more important than any individual frequency, is just intoxicatingly pleasing. The Sigberg website says forged by Norwegian metal, and the speakers are said to unleash the full barrage of rock and metal at any volume. Now, I do love me some metal from time to time, especially the harsher kinds, but like I said in my extreme metal recommendations video, which you can click up here to watch, I often do find that it's a genre I enjoy a little bit more in headphones. Now, why is that? Well, a lot of the metal I like, which is often on the outer branches of the extreme metal family tree, is often so densely and loudly mixed that unpacking it is just extremely demanding. But also that the maximal sort of dynamic saturation across the spectrum means that every single acoustic nonlinearity in my room and equipment will get triggered all at once when I'm listening through speakers. But all of that actually means that, despite what some gatekeeping audiophile dinosaurs might claim, metal can be incredibly revealing about a system's performance and capabilities. Now, anyone using metal to evaluate speakers should seriously consider adding the 2025 remaster of Meshuggah's Immutable to their list of test material. The 24-bit 96 kilohertz version on Tidal sounds impossibly chunky, but at the same time so clear and so open, with the placement of each sort of fractally convoluted drum strike laid out super precisely in the stereo image. And the bass, good lord, I got goosebumps that crawled from my arms all the way around my back and up my spine, which I'm pretty sure has never happened with metal bass guitar before. And it happened every time I play this track. Anyway, this is a record that somehow sounds concussingly heavy even over phone speakers and through the Sarannas. It's like someone dialed up gravity to 11. I really can't recommend this album enough with these speakers. A common thread through all of the very different kinds of music and even sort of non-music that I played is that I felt super immersed in the sound. Not immersed in the sense of being wrapped in a blanket, but more like in a galaxy of sound where I could make out every tiny little star and I could gaze ultra deep into the sound. Um, Dense and sort of full-bodied sound from especially very bass capable four range speakers can sometimes be antagonistic to this sensation, but somehow not with these speakers. I think maybe there is something about the microdynamics here that pushes that sense of immersion so far, but whatever it is marvelous. Now, I have heard even more open and sort of voluminous sound through other speakers, some electrostats, for example, but those have other problems normally. This kind of presentation, this immersion, this cloud of sound, this sort of place to stick your head into from a boxed speaker is, well, not entirely unique, but rather unusual at the very least. This characteristic was even more prominent with softer music. Um, they made me buy all three albums of Brian Eno that he made with BT Wolf um, because they sounded just so incredibly lush and beautiful through these speakers. I also ended up playing a lot of dub techno, not just because of the bass output, but perhaps more so because of the spatial presentation and how reverbs, synthetic or real, are presented through these speakers. I said, what the f out loud several times during this review with regards to the sound of reverb specifically. Transitioning from dubby sounds into the more sort of purely ambient, Burial's Streetlands, which I regrettably don't have on vinyl, I'm gonna buy it though. That EP is so lush, so deep and so enveloping and so sort of vast, and at the same time so intimate, so detailed, so precise. Like these things at once is really special. While Streetlands and Burial's music in general is ostensibly lo-fi music with deliberately added vinyl crackle and hiss, it's such a masterfully crafted sonic collage that the sum of its parts transcends that definition. So I just need to buy more Burial records. You too, probably. Staying in ambient land, the recently digital only, I think, release by Robert Rich and Barry Cleveland called Elliptical Passage was also really great through these speakers. One track in particular, Gathering Stars, triggered my taste synesthesia, which happens when sound is super compelling. Um, to me, it tastes like some sort of umami, but sweeter. Now, synesthesia is by definition, well, it's rare-ish and super personal. So I have not talked about it on this channel, and I'm kind of reluctant to bring it up when I talk about my impressions. But my point isn't the synesthesia effect, but rather that not all speakers seem to be able to trigger it, but these certainly could. Now, some more soft music. Björk's Visur Vattensenda Rusu. I don't know how to supposed to pronounce it in Icelandic. My apologies goes out to Iceland. Now, no matter the pronunciation, it is an emotional track in any system, but it almost broke me through these speakers. It is difficult to pinpoint what exactly makes a speaker more emotionally involving, since it's likely the interaction of many different things, but the stars sure aligned on this track with these speakers. And the presentation of voices here is just extraordinarily rewarding. On Keith Jarrett's Changeless, I just grinned like an idiot because the presentation is so lush. Again, that word, lush, is a real important descriptor of the speakers. Yet it is so detailed, and the timing interplay between the musicians is, I think, better presented through these than I might have ever heard. Perhaps thanks to the coaxial driver, I don't know, but it was incredible. Although I will say, speaking of this record, Changeless, Gary Peacock's bass protrudes a little too prominently here. And the record benefits from a spectral balance with the bass nudged down 1 or 2 dB relative to some other genres. But unlike traditional speakers, here you can just walk up to them and toggle the preset on the back, and now it sounds better. Um, yeah, it's not as simple as the app-controlled presets on the 8C, but still, at least you can do it. Oh, and of course, I should mention when talking about Keith Jarrett, these speakers do piano music beautifully. If your musical diet is majority piano, do not miss these speakers. The full range also means that they comfortably do the 27 hertz or whatever lowest note and beyond. The soundstage presentation here is not too dissimilar from the Dutch and Dutch 8C. Perhaps less laser-sharp delineation than the Key 3, but wide, natural, and satisfyingly deep. And again, that sense of immersion is ever present. Immersion relies on depth, and that wasn't just a way beyond the speakers either. Well-recorded, tightly mic'd vocals are ultra intimate here, making me almost feel like I'm invading the private space of the singer. I literally had that reaction with one track that came recommended by Sigberg, Matilda Storm's Cries Like a Baby. When I played that the first time, I almost recoiled because I felt like I was inappropriately close to her. Like I'm not supposed to stand that close or sit that close to someone. And I don't think I've had that happen that strongly with regular stereo playback before. The speaker's forward dispersion is sufficiently broad and spectrally consistent within that breadth that if I stand up or move to the sides, there's unusually little perceived change in frequency response. This means that they sound great off axis too, so while stereo imaging obviously breaks down when you do that, they seem great for social listening. It also means that you can toe them in quite aggressively and thus get even less sidewall reflection and still have proper frequency response in the listening position. Playing from the Grimm MU2's analog outputs retains a little bit of its splendor, but the extra A to D to D to A round trip inherent to most active speakers, including these, seems to undo the majority of the qualities that made me buy the MU2 in the first place. Had I not known firsthand that digital audio can sound the way the MU2 does with my regular setup, I don't think I could have imagined it. Now, all of this can be interpreted as a criticism of the speakers, as though I'm saying they are held back by their DAC design. And I mean, maybe that's the case, but the glass half full perspective is that these sound so good that had I not owned an 18,000 euro streamer DAC with even more expensive passive speakers, I would have struggled to find any room for improvement at all. The A to D conversion sounds very competent, and indeed playing vinyl through these was a delight as well. My impression is that you need to get into super ambitious vinyl systems before the internal architecture of these speakers become a meaningful bottleneck. My vinyl setup is, at least I think, pretty nice, and I didn't feel like it was compromised. But an internally digital speaker should ideally be fed a digital signal. So I tried a super cheap Roon endpoint, the Argon Audio Solo. This has SPDIF output digitally, so all my Roon content was kept digital for as long as possible. Its volume control is not very sophisticated, and I had to run it at like 50 or 60% of max output, or it got too loud from the speakers because they have a lot of gain. That much digital attenuation is rarely a good thing, but the resulting sound is still surprisingly rewarding. Perhaps a very tiny bit blurred and desaturated, but you really have to look for it. Ultimately, I prefer the MU2 despite the extra A to D to DDA round trip, but the difference versus this are small, and the price difference is just completely indefensible. This is what, a 1/100th of the price? Can that be true? Yeah, 1/100th of the price of the MU2. The internal DAC of these speakers is doing a terrific job, and I have no problem recommending a very modest streamer like this for these speakers. But what if I use a super sophisticated digital source with incredibly high quality upsampling, incredibly low jitter, extremely competently and ambitiously implemented digital volume control, like, oh, I don't know, the Grim Audio MU1? Will that make a difference? Well, while I was waiting for a sufficiently long AES cable to daisy chain the speakers using that protocol, I used the same 75 ohm coaxial SPDIF cable that I used with the Argon Solo. So apples to apples in terms of the interface. I grouped the Argon, am I pronouncing it differently? I grouped this Argon Solo with the MU1 in Roon, and I just matched their volume to within 1 dB, and I moved the cable between them to compare back and forth. And in that comparison, there is an increased voluminosity, is that a word? Voluminousness, and ease to the sound through the MU1, but the difference is relatively small, and it actually takes real effort to hear that difference. This could indicate that there is some relatively competent reclocking or other jitter elimination in the Hypex modules inside of the Sarannas, or that they don't benefit much from an upsampled signal because of how they handled high-res audio, for example. I don't know which it is, or if it's a combination. While I was waiting for an AudioQuest AES cable of the appropriate length, I bought a no-name cable, and it turns out it isn't the required 110 ohm impedance that the AES format requires, and this cable simply does not work with these speakers. Now, once I had a proper 5-meter AES cable, that sounded to me better than coaxial speed. That could depend on several different things. It could be that the AES output of the MU1 is somehow superior to the SPDIF output. Seems unlikely, but I don't know. It could be that the implementation on the speaker side is better for AES somehow. It could be that the format is superior somehow. It could be that the proper cables from AudioQuest are simply better than the ones I had, sort of mix of brands I had for coaxial SPDIF cables. Slight side rant inside of a side rant about digital signals in cables. A digital signal is transmitted as a square wave, but a square wave transmitted through a cable is still an analog signal. It's just interpreted digitally, interpreted as ones and zeros. But a square wave has infinite frequency range because the corners of the square, if they're perfectly square, have infinite resolution. I'm not going to get into a sidetrack inside of a sidetrack inside of a sidetrack about that. But it means that cable implementation or cable quality can affect the rounding of the square wave. And that slight rounding and variation in that rounding can affect when the signal is interpreted as a 1 or a 0, because over coaxial speed or AES, the clocking is in the signal. You're doing the the digital to analog conversion based on a clock that is derived from the incoming data stream. It isn't clocked separately. You can have a buffer and so on the DAC side. I don't know if these speakers do. I don't know if these Hypix modules do. But it could be that that signal is transmitted more reliably and more square wavily through a better cable, or through AES because it's a 3-pin protocol instead. Whatever it is, get proper digital cables. You'll thank me later. But a couple of more things about listening through the Graham Audio MU1. Like with the MU2, which I've made a video about, you can click here to see the video where I talk about why and how I decided to buy it. When listening through the MU1 with these speakers, something does happen when you listen for extended periods of time rather than sort of A/B hopping. The music gets under my skin in a way that I can't attribute to any specific sonic traits, but that is mega rewarding. Whatever it is they do, it seems to exist not just in the DAC version, but also in the pure digital streamer version. Is that the upsampling? Is that the clocking? Is it something else? I don't know. But so this is, as expected, a little bit better than the analog signal into the speakers from the MU2. And it is also meaningfully better than this cheap streamer, but this cheap streamer does incredibly well. So my conclusion is that for digital, a modest source will go a very long way. You can run this for years and not have, FOMO about the sound. But if you want to squeeze that one last percent of performance out of these speakers, you will want a maximally high quality source with a really well implemented digital volume control connected over AES with quality cables. I usually don't pay close attention to how manufacturers claim that their product sounds, since my experience is that I often disagree on some aspect of the verbiage and nuance of those descriptions. But when I was fact checking this review, I noticed that Sigberg describes these speakers in almost the exact same way as I have done. I mean, I wish I could point out something different or contradictory here, but all I can do is corroborate, basically. This indicates, at least to me, that Sigberg is both honest and knows what they're doing. If you watch my previous videos in this series, you might be inclined to ask if, compared to the Key 3 or the Dutch and Dutch 8C, which are somehow equally priced, are the Sigberg Sarannas providing better sound for the additional money? The issue with trying to answer something like that is that the question sort of assumes that better sound is a linear thing. Option A is either above or below option B. But it doesn't work that way, I think. It is multidimensional and tangled up in so many different factors. But if I had to pick one sound to live with, ignoring features and cost and assuming I'm listening in this specific room, I think I would choose Saranna. If I zoom out from that and take other factors into account, I would be missing the opportunity to use the amazing Bach plugin of the 8Cs. I would be less confident that they can be made to sound as good in other rooms, given the more limited and sort of arduous DSP interface here. I would need an external preamp or streamer with volume control instead of streaming straight to the speakers. The 8Cs are a Roon endpoint in and of themselves. And my personal preference for physical appearance would lean more towards the 8Cs, although these in black might be more up my alley. But even if we look myopically at sound alone, are those sonic differences worth this kind of money? Now, no one can answer that for you. If you are shopping for a speaker in this category and price range-ish, you need to consider whether the advanced features available in more technically complex options are important to you. If they are not, then on the merits of their sound, you should most definitely try to find a way to take a ride in these immersion machines. So, are they perfect then? Well, that depends on your perspective and on what you seek. I mentioned earlier that I have another pair of speakers in here with even more clarity and detail and texture definition than the Sarannas. So if that is what you seek, you do not want to miss the Cream Audio LS1C with the SB1 subs. That system costs significantly more, but also delivers something distinctly different than the Sarannas. Expect that review in about a month. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it. Thank you ever so much for watching. See ya.